I moved every dollar of my late grandfather's generation skipping trust into an irrevocable Spendthrift account, exactly 4 hours before my 20th birthday. It saved my life. The next morning, my father slid a plate of pancakes across our kitchen island. He smiled a warm, paternal smile and told me we needed to talk about family money. My blood ran cold. He had no idea I already knew his plan. My name is Indiana. I was 19 years old when I realized the man who raised me was building a legal cage to steal my future. Before I take you into that freezing colonial house in Connecticut, hit the like button and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. It helps more than you know. Drop your age and your city in the comments below. I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Tuesday in late October, 50 days before that breakfast. I was navigating my junior year as a forensic accounting major. I spent my days commuting on the Metro North train down to New Haven. I dissected corporate fraud case studies for hours. I never expected my first real investigation to happen at my own kitchen counter in Groton. The wind coming off Long Island Sound was rattling the loose window frames of our house. I was sorting through the mail. Most of it was junk. A marine supply catalog, a final notice from Eversource printed on harsh pink paper. Then I saw a thick ivory envelope. It was sliced open and shoved carelessly beneath a stack of unpaid utility bills. The return address belonged to the State of Connecticut Department of Revenue Services. My father, Richard, ran a legacy maritime logistics company in Mystic. He kept meticulous records for his shipping boats. He did not leave state tax documents sitting next to the coffee maker. I pulled the pages out. The header read, Certificate of Organization for Prescott Family Holdings, LLC. I frowned. Our family did not have a holding company. We barely had the cash flow to keep the aging diesel engines on the supply boats running. I took the paperwork upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door. I sat on my unmade bed and opened my laptop. I bypassed the public search portals. I logged directly into the state registry using my university credentials. I typed in the entity identification number. The results populated in stark black text. Sole managing member, Richard Prescott. Registered agent, address a small warehouse unit on the edge of the Mystic River, the exact location of his struggling firm. I pulled up the operating agreement draft attached to the filing. It outlined a structure engineered to absorb and distribute external capital. The document explicitly routed funds into commercial debt mitigation and educational trusts. We had no external capital. The maritime business was drowning in operational debt. My older brother Thomas was hemorrhaging out-of-state tuition at a Boston law school. I grabbed a legal pad and a pen. I wrote down the formation date of the LLC, October 4th. I wrote down the activation date for the commercial accounts linked in the footnotes, December 12th. I stared at the blue ink on the yellow paper. My stomach dropped. December 10th was my 20th birthday. At midnight on that exact date, the trust established by my grandfather would transfer into my name. It was a federally protected structure. It was designed to bypass estate taxes and bypass my father entirely. The trust contained enough capital to clear a commercial shipping debt. It contained enough to pay a second-year law school tuition. The holding company was not a routine business upgrade. It was a bucket waiting to catch a very specific leak. Downstairs, the heavy front door groaned open. I heard the familiar thud of my father dropping his work boots onto the mudroom floor. I heard the jingle of his keys hitting the ceramic bowl. His voice drifted up the stairwell, carrying a rough, exhausted warmth. He called my name. He told me he brought clam chowder from a spot on Route 1. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom. The state tax documents rested on my lap. My fingertips felt strangely numb. I had to go downstairs. I had to look into the eyes of a man who brought me dinner while engineering my financial ruin. I had to figure out how to look back at him without screaming. I walked down the wooden stairs of our colonial house with careful, measured steps. The heavy oak treads creaked under my weight. A familiar scent drifted up from the lower level. It was the rich, briny smell of local New England clam chowder mixed with the sharp undertone of diesel engine grease. That specific combination of scents had defined my entire childhood in Groton. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into the kitchen. Richard Prescott stood at the kitchen island. He was still wearing his faded canvas work jacket. The collar was frayed and the sleeves were stained with dark patches of mechanical oil. He was ladling the thick soup into 2 ceramic bowls. My father was not a cartoon villain. He was not a man who twirled a mustache or plotted financial crimes out of sheer greed. He was a broken patriarch. He had inherited Prescott Maritime Supply when he was 22 years old. His own father had suffered a fatal heart attack right on the docks in Mystic. Richard was forced to abandon his own college education to take over the ledger. He gave up his youth, his free time, and his health to keep a fleet of 3 aging supply boats running up and down the Connecticut coastline. I looked at his calloused hands. I watched him drop a handful of oyster crackers onto a paper napkin. It was incredibly difficult to reconcile the predatory tax documents upstairs with the tired man standing in front of me. When I was 7 years old, I caught a severe strain of pneumonia. The winter air off Long Island Sound had settled deep into my chest, and my lungs filled with fluid. I spent a terrifying week in the pediatric wing of the local hospital. Richard did not leave my bedside. He slept in a rigid plastic hospital chair for 3 days straight. He refused to go back to the docks until my fever broke and the doctors told him I was safe. He loved his children. I knew that fact in my bones. But love in the Prescott household had eventually become a casualty of basic economics. The maritime shipping industry had shifted over the last decade. Contracts dried up. Commercial fleets bypassed the smaller local ports. The diesel supply boats required constant, expensive repairs just to pass state environmental inspections. The business was bleeding capital every single month. Under the crushing weight of that stress, Richard began to view our family through a distorted lens of financial utility. He stopped seeing his children as individuals. He began to categorize us by our yield and our risk. My older brother, Thomas, was his primary liability. Thomas was 24 years old. He was currently residing in an overpriced brick brownstone in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. He was attempting to survive his second year of law school. Thomas did not possess a rigorous legal mind. He had struggled through basic undergraduate history courses and spent most of his weekends socializing. Yet Richard viewed him as the golden child of the Prescott family. Thomas was a fragile asset. He was a boy who needed constant, massive subsidies to maintain the illusion of success. Richard paid the $3,000 monthly rent without missing a single billing cycle. He believed that if Thomas dropped out of law school, the family legacy would suffer a fatal public humiliation. He believed Thomas was destined to become a corporate lawyer who would eventually save the maritime firm with his brilliant legal connections. It was a fantasy built on a foundation of blind parental enabling. I was categorized entirely differently. I was the pragmatic forensic accounting student who commuted 2 hours every single day. I paid for my own university textbooks by working late shifts at the campus library in New Haven. I bought my winter boots from a thrift store in New London. When the alternator on my rusted sedan failed, I did not ask for money. I watched internet tutorials and replaced the part myself in the freezing driveway. Richard looked at me and saw a resilient survivor. He rationalized that I could absorb the harsh realities of the adult world. He believed I could take out high-interest federal student loans to finish my degree. He believed I could wait tables to pay for my own apartment. I was strong enough to carry a heavy burden of debt. Thomas was not. Therefore, Thomas required the safety net. I sat down on a wooden stool at the kitchen island. Richard pushed the bowl of hot chowder toward me. He asked me how my classes went today. His voice was thick with genuine New England pragmatism. He asked if the Metro North train was delayed again because he heard the weather was getting rough down near the city. I stared at the cream-colored soup. The steam rose into the cold kitchen air and fogged the lower half of the nearby window. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. I was sitting across from a man who remembered my train schedule. He remembered that I liked extra crackers with my soup. He possessed a terrifyingly genuine paternal warmth. Yet upstairs, in my locked bedroom, a legal document proved he was actively building a corporate structure to steal my future. In my university accounting seminars, we learned about the fraud triangle. The professors taught us that financial crimes require 3 elements to occur: opportunity pressure and rationalization. I was sitting at a kitchen island, staring at the physical embodiment of the fraud triangle. The generation skipping trust established by my grandfather was the opportunity. The failing shipping business and the exorbitant law school tuition of my brother provided the pressure. The twisted paternal belief that he was saving the family legacy was the rationalization. Richard truly believed his own narrative. He believed that sacrificing my financial independence to save his company was a noble duty. He was reallocating resources to save a sinking ship. In his mind, my grandfather made a terrible mistake by leaving the trust fund to me instead of funneling it directly into the business. Richard was simply correcting a historical accounting error. He sat down across from me and rubbed his tired eyes. He mentioned that the commercial diesel supplier in Mystic was raising prices again next quarter. He let out a long, heavy sigh. He said it was a tough season for the docks, but family always finds a way to weather the storm. He said family always protects family. He looked right at my face when he said those words. His expression was calm and steady. He felt absolutely no guilt. I picked up my metal spoon. My hand was shaking so badly, the spoon tapped rapidly against the edge of the ceramic bowl. I quickly lowered it and hid my trembling hands under the counter. I forced my breathing to slow down. I told him the train ride was fine. I told him my audit examination went well. Every single syllable felt like broken glass in my throat. I was actively participating in his illusion. He smiled and nodded, taking a bite of his food. Then he casually shifted his posture. He mentioned that December was approaching very fast. He said I was going to be 20 years old soon, and we needed to sit down with a lawyer to discuss some adult financial responsibilities. He framed the statement as a helpful fatherly gesture. He said he wanted to make sure my inheritance was structured properly before the new year, so I would not have to worry about complicated taxes. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The walls of the colonial house seemed to lean inward, pressing against my shoulders. He was laying the groundwork for the ambush. He was setting the stage to present the forged power of attorney documents. He expected me to sign away my grandfather's gift out of blind familial loyalty. I realized he did not respect my intelligence at all. He thought I was just a naive college student who would nod obediently and sign whatever paper he placed on the counter. He thought the girl studying corporate fraud would not recognize a shell company operating under her own roof. A sudden, violent wave of nausea crashed over me. I stood up abruptly. The wooden legs of the stool scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. Richard looked up in surprise, holding his spoon in midair. I told him I forgot to submit a crucial online assignment for my accounting seminar. I lied and said the portal was going to close in 10 minutes. I walked away from the steaming bowl of chowder before he could ask another question. I walked into the mudroom and grabbed my car keys from the ceramic bowl. I pushed through the heavy front door. I stepped out into the freezing Connecticut night. The wind hit my face like a physical blow. I walked toward my rusted sedan parked in the dark driveway, my chest heaving with an emotion I could no longer suppress. I did not walk out the front door immediately. I stopped in the mudroom with my hand hovering over the cold brass doorknob. Running away was a reflex, but fleeing the house would not save my inheritance. I took a slow breath, pulling the familiar scent of salt and diesel into my lungs. I turned around and walked back into the kitchen. Richard was still standing at the island, finishing his bowl of chowder. I sat back down on the wooden stool. I picked up my metal spoon. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see how deep his deception went. I kept my voice flat and casual. I told him my forensic accounting professor assigned a new case study on corporate structures. I said the assignment required us to analyze local maritime businesses. I framed the inquiry as a simple academic curiosity. I asked him if Prescott Maritime Supply had ever considered forming a family limited liability company to manage operational debt. He did not drop his spoon. He did not flinch. His heart rate probably stayed perfectly steady. Richard wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and looked at me with profound, gentle pride. He said corporate restructuring was far too expensive for a small fleet of aging supply boats. He told me the business was a straightforward sole proprietorship and would stay that way. He reached across the counter and patted my hand. He said he was incredibly proud of my academic focus. He told me I was going to be a brilliant accountant one day. He lied to my face with the smooth delivery of a man who believed his own narrative. He poured himself another cup of black coffee and asked if I wanted a second serving of soup. I declined. I took my bowl to the sink, rinsed it under the cold tap, and walked out of the room. I stepped out the front door into the biting New England winter. The wind whipping off Long Island Sound felt like sharp needles against my exposed cheeks. I walked down the gravel driveway toward my 10-year-old rusted sedan. The car was a physical monument to my forced independence. I bought it with money saved from bussing tables in Groton during high school. The heater barely worked, and the driver's side door required a hard shove to close properly. I unlocked the door, slid into the freezing driver's seat, and shut myself inside the dark cabin. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the frosted windshield. I sat in the silent, unheated car. I did not turn the key in the ignition. For a few minutes, I just stared at the steering wheel. Then the adrenaline from the kitchen faded, and the terrifying reality of my situation collapsed onto my chest. I could not breathe. My lungs forgot how to pull oxygen from the air. I gasped, a harsh, jagged sound echoing in the small space. My vision blurred. I was having a severe panic attack. This was not a cinematic moment of quiet, dignified resolve. I did not sit in the dark plotting a brilliant counterattack with a cool, detached smirk. I broke down entirely. I was 19 years old, and the only parent I had left was actively engineering my financial ruin to fund my brother. The tears that fell were messy, angry, and uncoordinated. They tracked hot paths down my freezing skin. I clamped my hands over my mouth to muffle the sound of my own sobbing. I did not want Richard to hear me from the living room window. The emotional hunger for a normal family ripped through me. I wanted a father who protected me. I wanted a father who viewed me as a daughter, not an expendable asset to be liquidated for the sake of Thomas and his Boston Law School tuition. The unfairness of the spreadsheet logic burned in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image of the state tax documents remained burned behind my eyelids. I balled my hands into tight fists. I brought them down hard against the rigid plastic of the steering wheel. I hit it once. I hit it again. I struck the plastic until the skin across my knuckles split and bruised. The dull physical pain grounded me, pulling my brain back from the edge of the panic. I leaned my forehead against the cold steering column, shivering uncontrollably. I let the tears run dry. I had to accept the clinical facts of my existence. Richard was not going to wake up tomorrow and suddenly realize my worth. Thomas was never going to decline the tuition money out of a sudden burst of sibling loyalty. My family was a sinking ship, and they had already designated me as the life raft. If I confronted Richard directly, he would deploy a masterful guilt trip. He would use his paternal authority to twist the narrative, making me feel selfish for wanting to keep the money my grandfather specifically left to me. He would bring up the hospital chair, the pneumonia, and the sacrifices he made for the docs. He would crush my defenses through sheer emotional attrition. I could not fight him with emotion. Emotion was his territory. Emotion was the weapon he used to justify the theft. I had to fight him with cold, unforgiving bureaucracy. I lifted my head from the steering wheel. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. I looked at the dark silhouette of the colonial house. I realized that the law was my only shield. The state registry, the trust codes, the banking regulations. These were the tools I had to master. I was entirely on my own. I had no safety net, no sympathetic relatives to call, and no financial buffer to fall back on. Growing up in a maritime town like Groton taught you a specific kind of endurance. You learned to read the tide charts. You learned that ignoring a storm warning was a fatal error. My grandfather understood that harsh reality better than anyone. He built his wealth outside of the family shipping firm. He invested in commercial real estate near New Haven and quietly accumulated a stable portfolio. He saw the cracks in Richard long before anyone else did. He noticed how Richard coddled Thomas. He noticed how Richard expected me to handle my own problems. That was why my grandfather bypassed his own son. That was why he set up the Generation Skipping Trust in my name. He wanted to give me an armored hull. He wanted to ensure I could chart my own course without being dragged down by the failing family logistics firm. Richard viewed the trust as an accounting error. I knew it was a lifeline. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of the sedan. I opened a mobile browser. I typed in the search parameters for the Connecticut Uniform Trust Code. The legal jargon filled the small screen. I read through the dense paragraphs detailing fiduciary duties, spendthrift clauses, and the mechanisms required to sever a parental power of attorney. The statutes were clear, but the implementation was a terrifying labyrinth. I learned that simply moving the money into a standard checking account on my 20th birthday would not protect me. Richard could still pressure me into a joint account. He could forge a signature on a standard bank transfer. The only way to build an impenetrable wall was to establish a new, irrevocable spendthrift trust with an independent corporate trustee. I needed a professional financial institution to hold the assets, a vault that Richard could never access, no matter how many guilt trips he deployed. But securing a corporate trustee in Connecticut was not a simple retail banking transaction. The process required a specialized estate attorney. It required a formal underwriting process. The banks mandated rigorous identity verification under federal regulations to prevent money laundering and fraud. I scrolled down the legal advisory page. My eyes locked onto a specific regulatory timeline. The standard onboarding and asset transfer protocol for a high net worth corporate trust took a minimum of 45 days to execute. I looked at the calendar icon at the top of my phone screen. It was late October. My 20th birthday was exactly 50 days away. The margin for error was razor thin. I had a 5-day window to find a lawyer, secure a corporate trustee, draft the complex legal architecture, and initiate the transfer protocol. If I missed a single signature, if I failed a single background check, the funds would remain exposed on the morning of December 10th. I sat in the freezing car, the bruise on my knuckles throbbing in time with my pulse. Finding a lawyer in New Haven was only the first step. The real nightmare was figuring out how a broke college student with less than $300 in her checking account was going to afford the heavy legal retainer required to hire a top-tier estate attorney, all while living under the same roof as the man she was preparing to sue. The Metro-North train ride from Groton down the Connecticut coastline was a familiar blur of gray water and bare trees. I sat near the smudged window with my accounting textbooks open on my lap. I was not studying the assigned syllabus. I was reviewing the printed pages of the state registry database. I traced the corporate outline of Prescott Family Holdings with a red pen. I was searching for structural weaknesses in my father's plan. I had exactly 50 days until my 20th birthday. The rhythm of the train tracks felt like a ticking clock. New Haven is a city defined by sharp economic contrasts. You have the towering Gothic architecture of the university standing shoulder to shoulder with working-class neighborhoods. I walked 3 blocks from the campus center to a brick building on Orange Street. The brass plaque beside the heavy wooden door read, Harrison and Caldwell Estate Law. I did not have a formal appointment. I had sent a desperate email at 4 a.m. from the freezing cabin of my rusted sedan. A paralegal had replied at dawn, offering me a 30-minute cancellation slot at noon. I walked into a quiet reception area. The air smelled like old paper and lemon polish. A receptionist directed me down a narrow hallway to a corner office. The attorney, sitting behind the heavy mahogany desk, was a woman named Evelyn. She wore a tailored navy blazer, and her gray hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She looked at me with sharp, evaluating eyes. I sat down in a rigid leather guest chair. I did not waste her limited time with a tearful, emotional backstory. I placed the state tax documents and the draft of the operating agreement directly on her desk. I told her my father was planning to absorb my generation's skipping trust into a commercial holding company. I detailed his strategy to use the funds to float a failing maritime logistics firm in Mystic. I outlined his secondary goal of paying out-of-state law school tuition for my older brother. Evelyn reviewed the paperwork in silence. Her eyes scanned the printed lines with clinical speed. She tapped her silver pen against the edge of the desk. She told me the legal architecture my father built was terrifyingly efficient. She explained that the moment I turned 20, the trust assets would legally vest in my name. My father was relying on a durable power of attorney to execute the transfer into his shell company before I even woke up on my birthday. He needed my physical signature to grant him that ultimate financial authority. He was banking on my blind compliance and a lifetime of conditioned obedience. He thought I would sign the papers over breakfast without reading the fine print. I asked her how I stop him from accessing the money. Evelyn folded her hands and leaned forward across the desk. She told me I had to strike first and strike silently. She detailed the specific mechanics of the Connecticut Uniform Trust Code. Moving the money into a standard retail checking account was useless. My father could simply march me into a local branch and apply immense psychological pressure until I authorized a wire transfer. I needed to construct an armored vault. I needed to establish a new, irrevocable spendthrift trust. The spendthrift clause was the crucial defensive weapon. Evelyn explained that this specific legal provision barred any external creditor from ever attaching a lien to the assets. It meant the maritime logistics firm could never use my money to pay off disgruntled diesel suppliers. It meant my brother Thomas could never tap the funds to cover his Boston rent. The trust would be managed exclusively by an independent corporate trustee. The corporate trustee would have a strict fiduciary duty to me alone. They would deny any withdrawal requests that did not directly benefit my personal welfare. Evelyn said it would remove the emotional warfare from the equation entirely. Even if my father screamed or begged or threatened to disown me, the corporate trustee would remain an impenetrable stone wall. It sounded like a perfect and flawless defense. I felt a brief surge of hope blossom in my chest. Then Evelyn delivered the harsh, logistical reality. She told me establishing a corporate trustee is not a fast or simple process. The procedure is governed by strict federal banking regulations designed to monitor wealth transfers. She cited the Bank Secrecy Act and the specific Customer Identification Program protocols. Financial institutions are federally mandated to conduct deep underwriting on high net worth accounts to prevent fraud and money laundering. They trace the origin of every single dollar before they accept fiduciary responsibility. The mandatory vetting process takes a minimum of 45 days to complete. I sat very still in the leather chair. The rich smell of the lemon polish suddenly made me nauseous. I looked at the small calendar sitting on her desk. I ran the numbers in my head. I had exactly 50 days until December 10th. The federal underwriting process required 45 days. That left me with a buffer of exactly 5 days. 5 days to gather every piece of identifying documentation and historical tax records. 5 days to sign the preliminary agreements and fund the trust. If the bank found a minor clerical error, the timeline would pause. If a signature was missing or delayed in the mail, the transfer would stall. If the money was not secured by midnight on my birthday, my father would execute his power of attorney at dawn. The margin for error was razor thin. I could feel my pulse ticking rapidly in the hollow of my throat. I asked Evelyn what would happen if the timeline lapsed by a single day. She looked at me with a grim, pragmatic expression. She said the funds would land in a transitional holding state upon distribution. In that vulnerable window, my father could file an emergency injunction claiming I was financially incompetent. He could use his status as my sole surviving parent to freeze the assets pending a psychological evaluation. Once the money entered his holding company, I would have to spend years fighting him in civil court. I would drown in corporate legal fees before I ever saw a dime of my inheritance. I told her I understood the extreme risks. I told her we needed to start the underwriting process immediately. I was prepared to sign whatever documents she needed to initiate the federal review. I expected her to slide a stack of intake forms across the desk. Instead, she pulled out a single sheet of paper from a drawer. It was a standard client engagement letter. She placed it in front of me and pointed to a line near the bottom. Evelyn kept her voice steady and professional. She told me she was willing to take my case and guide me through the labyrinth. She said her firm had a strong relationship with a reputable corporate trustee in Hartford who could expedite the federal review. But she operated a private law practice. Constructing an irrevocable spendthrift trust and coordinating with a corporate bank required extensive billable hours. She could not initiate the paperwork or contact the Hartford trustee without a formal retainer fee. I looked at the bold number printed on the page. It was a modest retainer for a seasoned estate attorney handling a complex corporate transfer. It was an astronomical fortune for a 19-year-old college student. I thought about the current balance of my personal checking account. I had less than $300 to my name. Most of my income from the campus library went directly to my train pass and my accounting textbooks. I lived on cheap ramen noodles and instant coffee. I could not ask my father for a loan. Requesting a sudden large sum of cash would immediately trigger his suspicion. He monitored the family finances with ruthless precision. If he saw money moving toward a law firm, he would investigate and uncover my defense. I could not apply for a personal bank loan. I had no credit history, and securing a line of credit required a parental cosigner. The very financial system designed to protect young adults was effectively chained to the man I was trying to escape. Evelyn watched me stare at the paper. She possessed enough experience to read the panic settling over my features. She told me I had until the end of the week to secure the funds. If I missed that window, the 45-day federal timeline would bleed past my birthday. The legal shield would shatter before it was even built. She said she would hold the file open until Friday afternoon. I thanked her for her time. I stood up and walked out of the brick building into the cold New Haven afternoon. The Gothic spires of the university loomed over the street like silent judges. Students walked past me laughing and carrying coffee cups. They existed in a normal reality where their biggest fear was failing a midterm exam. I was standing on a sidewalk calculating how to fund a secret legal war against my own blood. I needed thousands of dollars in untraceable cash. I needed it in less than 3 days. I had to find a way to monetize the only pieces of my life my father did not control. I walked from the law office straight to the university library. The campus in New Haven was bathed in the harsh, angled light of late autumn. Students hurried past me wrapped in thick wool scarves and carrying expensive espresso cups. They were stressing about upcoming fraternity formals and weekend ski trips. I was carrying a manila folder that held the blueprint for a covert legal war against my own father. I found a secluded wooden desk on the 3rd floor of the library, deep in the stacks of the economics section. The air smelled of dry paper and floor wax. I pulled the heavy chair out and sat down. I opened the folder and stared at the retainer agreement Evelyn had given me. The bold black numbers printed on the final page seemed to mock my reality. It was a standard fee for a seasoned estate attorney establishing a complex corporate trust. For a 19-year-old college student, it was a steep, insurmountable cliff. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and opened my banking application. The screen loaded my current available balance, $284.16. That was the sum total of my financial existence. It was the result of hoarding my meager paychecks from the campus library. It covered my monthly Metro North commuter rail pass. It bought my generic instant coffee and the bulk packages of ramen noodles I ate for dinner. I stared at the digital numbers until my eyes burned. The retainer required thousands. I had exactly 3 days to bridge that impossible gap before Evelyn closed my file and the 45-day federal underwriting window collapsed. My mind shifted into the analytical mode I spent hours refining in my forensic accounting seminars. I treated my own life like a distressed corporate ledger. I needed to generate rapid, untraceable, liquid capital. The first logical option for any adult facing a cash deficit is debt. I opened a new tab on my phone and researched personal loans. The harsh reality of the American financial system for young adults immediately slammed the door in my face. I was 19. I had no established credit history. I did not own a house to leverage. My rusted sedan was essentially worthless on paper. Any traditional banking institution would require a guarantor to underwrite an unsecured personal loan. They would require a signature from a parent. If I asked Richard to co-sign a bank loan, the illusion of my compliance would shatter instantly. He was a man who scrutinized every incoming utility bill and cross-referenced every shipping manifest at his docks. If he saw a hard credit inquiry linked to a New Haven law firm, he would tear my life apart, searching for the reason. He would find Evelyn. He would discover the irrevocable trust protocol. He would force me to sign the power of attorney paperwork right there in the kitchen before I could mount any further defense. Traditional credit was a trap. The pressure of my dual existence began to settle heavily on my shoulders. I opened my backpack and pulled out my advanced audit textbook. I had a midterm examination scheduled for the following morning. The curriculum was unforgiving. The professors demanded flawless execution. My academic standing was the only reason I received the partial scholarships that made my tuition affordable. If my grades slipped, the university would pull my funding. More importantly, my perfect academic record was my primary camouflage. Richard expected me to be the self-sufficient, highly focused daughter. He relied on my predictable routine. If I failed an exam or started skipping lectures, the university would send an academic warning to our home address in Groton. Richard would notice the deviation. He would start asking questions. I had to maintain the pristine facade of a dedicated student while quietly orchestrating the financial sabotage of his holding company. I opened the textbook to a chapter on asset liquidation. I tried to read the paragraphs detailing corporate bankruptcy procedures. The black text blurred on the glossy white page. A dull ache bloomed at the base of my skull. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to force the exhaustion away. The sheer physical toll of living in a constant state of hypervigilance was draining my reserves. I looked around the quiet library. A girl 2 desks over was complaining quietly to her friend about a bad grade on a sociology paper. A boy across the aisle was sleeping with his head resting on a laptop keyboard. They were allowed to be young. They were allowed to make mistakes and call their parents for comfort. I was sitting in the same building, carrying the weight of a dying maritime logistics firm and the predatory greed of a father who viewed me as a line item. For a dangerous, fleeting second, I considered giving up. The thought was a soft, seductive whisper in the back of my mind. What if I just let the deadline pass? What if I let him execute the power of attorney on my birthday? I could surrender the trust fund and let him pay for Thomas and his Boston law school. I could stop fighting. I could go back to being the quiet daughter who fixed her own car and asked for nothing. It would be so much easier to simply lose. Then I remembered the physical draft of the document hidden in his mystic office. I remembered the scrap piece of paper where he had practiced forging my signature. He was not just asking for a sacrifice. He was orchestrating a theft. He was stripping away my armored hull to plug the holes in a sinking ship he refused to abandon. The brief moment of weakness evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, clinical determination. I looked back down at the retainer agreement. I could not borrow the money. I could not earn it working at the campus library. I had to liquidate a physical asset. I took an inventory of everything I owned. My rusted sedan was vital for my commute to the train station. If I sold it, I could not get to New Haven to meet with the attorney. My laptop was a requirement for my accounting courses. My winter clothes were cheap thrift store finds lacking any resale value. I owned nothing of consequence, except for one small wooden box. My grandfather had given me a carved cedar box on my 16th birthday. It was a piece of my late grandmother. She died when I was very young, but I remembered her wearing elegant, understated pieces. When my grandfather handed me the box, he told me to keep it safe. He said it was an emergency fund, hidden in plain sight. Inside the velvet-lined interior rested her vintage jewelry collection. There was a heavy gold herringbone necklace, a pair of diamond stud earrings, a platinum tennis bracelet. Richard did not know the collection existed. My grandfather handed it to me in secret while we were sitting on the back porch of his house. He told me Richard had a habit of pawning the past to pay for the future, and he wanted to make sure I kept a piece of the family history for myself. I sat in the library and realized the cruel irony of my situation. I was going to have to do exactly what my grandfather feared. I was going to have to pawn my family history to protect my actual future. The emotional cost of the decision felt like a heavy stone resting at the bottom of my stomach. Those pieces of jewelry were the only tangible connections I had left to the people who actually loved me without conditions. They were not corporate assets. They were memories wrapped in gold and platinum. Giving them up felt like a profound betrayal of the only safety net I truly valued. But retaining the jewelry while losing the generation-skipping trust was a fatal mathematical error. The vintage gold would not pay for my independence. It would not block the holding company. I had to sever my emotional attachment to the objects in order to save the capital they represented. I closed my accounting textbook and shoved it into my backpack. I folded the retainer agreement carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of my coat. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was early afternoon. I had enough time to catch the northbound train back to Groton before the evening rush hour. I needed to retrieve the carved cedar box from the back of my closet. I walked out of the library and headed toward the train station. The wind had picked up, carrying the bitter chill of the impending winter. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. I was no longer a confused college student hoping for a parental rescue. I was a strategist, preparing to fund a war. I knew exactly where I needed to go the next morning. There was a high-end broker down the coast who dealt in estate liquidations. I was going to walk into his shop and trade the only sentimental items I owned for a stack of untraceable cash. I was going to buy my armor. I drove my rusted sedan southbound on Interstate 95 the next morning. The heater was broken. I wore a heavy wool coat and gripped the freezing steering wheel to keep my hands from shaking. The drive from the shipyards of Groton to the affluent enclave of Westport is only 60 miles. It feels like crossing an invisible border into a different universe. Groton and Mystic were built on blue-collar sweat and grinding physical labor. My father operated in a legacy maritime industry that was rapidly dying. Recent state economic initiatives branded the future as the new Connecticut blue economy. The local government wanted sustainable coastal engineering and high-tech ocean research. They did not want aging diesel supply boats leaking oil into the historic harbors. The state was leaving men like Richard behind. He was a dinosaur suffocating under modern environmental regulations and shifting global supply chains. That systemic economic pressure was the specific reason he was trying to steal my trust fund. He was trying to buy his way into a future that had already rejected him. Westport was the exact opposite of my hometown. Westport was where the hedge fund managers and corporate executives resided. It was a town defined by manicured hedges and imported luxury vehicles parked along pristine sidewalks. It was exactly where you went when you needed to quietly liquidate untraceable assets. The economic disparity in our state was a harsh reality I studied often in my university courses. I had read a recent demographic report showing the intense wealth gap among college students in New Haven. Half the student body came from the top 20% of income brackets. The other half relied on multiple jobs just to afford textbooks. I was firmly in the latter category. I had no safety net. I had to build my own. I parked my car 3 blocks away from the main commercial district. I did not want my rattling exhaust pipe drawing attention from the local boutiques. I walked down a brick-paved sidewalk carrying my canvas backpack. Inside the front pocket sat the carved cedar box. I found the address the estate attorney had vaguely suggested during our brief meeting. It was not a dusty pawn shop with flashing neon signs in the window. It was a high-end estate liquidator. The storefront featured unmarked frosted glass and a discreet brass buzzer. I pressed the button. A heavy magnetic lock clicked open. I stepped into a showroom that smelled of expensive leather furniture and heavily filtered air. A man in a tailored gray suit stood behind a polished glass counter. He did not look like a traditional pawnbroker. He looked like an investment banker. He wore thin wire-rimmed glasses and maintained a quiet, evaluating posture. I walked up to the counter. I unzipped my backpack and pulled out the cedar box. I placed it gently on the glass. The small hinges whispered as I opened the lid. The dark velvet interior held my late grandmother's vintage jewelry. There was a heavy gold herringbone necklace. There was a pair of pristine diamond stud earrings. There was a platinum tennis bracelet. These pieces were the only physical artifacts I possessed from a woman who loved me without a hidden agenda. My grandfather had handed them to me in secret many years ago. He knew a day would arrive when I needed a financial lifeline that Richard could not intercept. I was staring at my own family history resting on the glass. The man in the gray suit pulled a jeweler loop from his breast pocket. He picked up a gold necklace. He examined the intricate clasp and weighed the metal in his palm. He moved to the platinum bracelet, checking the clarity of the stones under a bright halogen desk lamp. His movements were clinical and highly practiced. He did not ask me about the sentimental value of the items. He did not care that the diamonds were worn during my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. He only cared about the resale margin and the purity of the stones. The silence in the room stretched for several long minutes. He placed the items back onto the velvet display. He looked at me and quoted a number. It was a fraction of their actual market worth. It was a lowball offer designed to exploit the obvious desperation of a college student selling estate jewelry on a weekday morning. A year ago, I would have argued the price. I would have felt a deep, stinging insult on behalf of my grandfather. I would have grabbed the box and walked right out the door. But I was no longer a sentimental teenager holding on to the past. I was a forensic accounting student fighting a corporate war against my own blood. I calculated his quoted number against the exact figure Evelyn required for her legal retainer. The broker offered just enough to cover the law firm fees and the initial filing costs for the Hartford corporate trustee. There would be nothing left over. I did not negotiate. I did not ask for a higher percentage. I simply nodded my head and said yes. The broker looked mildly surprised by my immediate surrender. He opened a heavy steel safe located beneath the counter. He counted out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. He slid the money across the glass. I picked up the cash and placed it into a plain paper envelope. I left the cedar box and the jewelry on the counter. I turned around and walked out into the cold Westport air. The sting of the sacrifice hit me the moment the frosted glass door shut behind me. A hollow ache bloomed in the center of my chest. I had just sold the only pure memory I owned. But as I walked down the sidewalk, the grief began to harden. It calcified into a cold, unyielding detachment. Richard forced me to sell my grandmother's legacy. His predatory spreadsheet logic pushed me into that estate liquidator. The sadness evaporated and a sharp, clinical anger took its place. I walked directly to a local retail bank branch on the corner. I did not have an account at this specific institution. I stood in line and used the cash to purchase a certified bank check made payable to Harrison and Caldwell Estate Law. I placed the untraceable paper into a priority overnight mailing envelope. I included the signed preliminary engagement letter Evelyn had given me the day before. I walked outside and dropped the thick envelope into a blue postal collection box on the street corner. I heard it hit the bottom of the metal bin. I had just purchased my armor. The 45-day federal underwriting process was officially active. I drove back up the coastline toward Groton. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Connecticut sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Securing the legal representation was only the first phase of the defense. Evelyn had warned me that establishing the irrevocable Spendthrift Trust would trigger a rigorous review process. The corporate trustee in Hartford would eventually require proof of the exact threat we were defending against. If Richard challenged the trust transfer later, he could claim I was acting under undue influence or mental duress. He could argue to a judge that his power of attorney was a standard familial arrangement and I was behaving erratically. I needed hard, undeniable evidence of his intended fraud to bulletproof the corporate vault. I needed to prove he was not acting in my best interest. I knew exactly where that proof was located. Richard kept all his draft contracts and financial schematics locked in a heavy steel filing cabinet at his Mystic Logistics office. He guarded that room with paranoid intensity. He never let anyone inside without his direct supervision. He treated his paperwork like state secrets. A regional maritime supply conference was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. Richard was slated to attend a panel discussion on port infrastructure. It was the only window of time his office would be empty. I had paid for the legal shield. Now I had to infiltrate his sanctuary and steal his playbook before he even realized a game was being played. The Regional Maritime Logistics Conference was held on the first Saturday of November at a large convention hotel near the interstate. It was an annual gathering of Port Authority officials, supply chain managers, and independent fleet operators. Richard never missed it. He viewed the event as a crucial networking opportunity to secure municipal contracts for his struggling company. He spent the entire morning ironing a stiff gray suit he despised wearing. I sat at the kitchen island drinking black coffee and watching him prepare. I kept my expression neutral. He complained about the rising cost of event parking and told me he would be gone until the late afternoon. I listened to his heavy boots cross the hardwood floor. The front door clicked shut. I waited by the front window until his dark blue pickup truck turned the corner and disappeared down the street. I dumped my coffee into the sink. I grabbed my car keys and a small black canvas pouch I kept hidden in my desk drawer. I drove my rusted sedan out of Groton and took the coastal route toward Mystic. The sky was an unbroken sheet of pale gray. The water of the Sound looked like cold iron. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the car allowed me to mentally rehearse the floor plan of Prescott Maritime Supply. The boatyard was located on a narrow strip of commercial zoning along the edge of the river. The property was surrounded by a weathered chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. The main structure was a large corrugated metal warehouse where the mechanics rebuilt diesel engines. Attached to the front of the warehouse was a small brick building that served as the administrative hub. It was Saturday. The mechanics were off duty. The yard was entirely deserted. I parked my car behind a stack of empty wooden shipping crates to conceal it from the main access road. The air smelled strongly of low-tide rotting kelp and spilled motor oil. I walked up to the side entrance of the warehouse. I possessed a spare key to the loading bay. Richard gave it to me years ago when he used to make me file his old tax receipts over the summer. I unlocked the metal door and stepped into the cavernous workspace. The interior was freezing and silent. Dust motes drifted through the pale light angling down from the high skylights. I walked past the dismantled engine blocks and the racks of heavy tools. I approached the short hallway that led to the administrative offices. At the end of the hall stood a heavy, solid oak door. This was the entrance to the private office of my father. He treated this room like a sovereign territory. He always kept it locked. I did not have a key to this specific door, but growing up in a boatyard surrounded by rough dock workers provided a unique education. When I was 14, a retired mechanic named Sullivan worked for my father. Sullivan was a pragmatic man who frequently locked his own toolboxes by accident. He taught me how to bypass basic tumbler mechanisms using a simple tension wrench and a steel pick. He told me it was a useful skill for a girl to learn because doors would not always open just because she asked politely. I unzipped the small black canvas pouch. I pulled out the thin metal tools. I knelt in front of the oak door and inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway. I applied a light, steady pressure with my left index finger. I slid the pick into the upper channel. I felt the tiny brass pins binding inside the cylinder. I manipulated them one by one. The first pin set with a faint click, then the second. I adjusted my angle. The final pin dropped into place. The cylinder rotated smoothly. I turned the heavy brass knob and pushed the door open. The office smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the distinct pine scent of his aftershave. The room was dark. The wooden blinds were drawn tight against the windows. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I used the flashlight function on my phone, keeping the beam angled low toward the floor. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind the desk stood a heavy steel lateral filing cabinet. This was the vault. This was where Richard stored his commercial shipping manifests, his municipal contracts, and his private ledgers. The cabinet featured an integrated locking bar mechanism. It was an older model, built in the late 90s. I used the same tension wrench and pick. The steel lock required more physical force than the oak door, but the internal pins were worn from decades of use. The mechanism yielded in less than 2 minutes. I grabbed the handle of the top drawer and pulled. The metal tracks let out a harsh metallic scrape that sounded terrifyingly loud in the quiet building. I froze and listened to the empty warehouse. Nothing moved. I aimed my phone light into the drawer. Hundreds of manila folders were packed tightly together. They were organized by year and vendor. I saw tabs labeled Coast Guard compliance. I saw tabs for Eversource utilities and regional diesel suppliers. I began to sift through the heavy cardstock. My fingertips traced the edges of the folders. I moved to the back of the drawer where the current year files were kept. I searched for anything labeled Prescott Holdings or trust accounts. My hand brushed against a thick, unmarked folder wedged between outdated environmental permits. It was hidden intentionally. I pulled it out and rested it on the flat surface of his mahogany desk. I opened the cover. The first page was a printed email chain from a corporate attorney based in New London. The subject line read, "Execution Timeline for Prescott Entity." I moved the email aside. Beneath it lay a multi-page legal document printed on heavy bond paper. The header read, "Durable Power of Attorney and Financial Proxy." I shined the light directly onto the text. The designated principal listed was Indiana Prescott. The designated agent was Richard Prescott. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs looking for the specific dates. My eyes found the execution clause at the bottom of the second page. The document was dated December 8th. It was engineered to be signed exactly 2 days before my 20th birthday. He was planning to secure the legal authority mere hours before the Generation Skipping Trust transferred into my name. I turned to the third page. This section detailed the exact fiduciary powers granted to the agent. The text explicitly authorized Richard to reallocate all liquid assets into Prescott Family Holdings, LLC. A subsequent subclause dictated the distribution of those assets. The language was cold and clinical. It mandated a fiduciary allocation for the educational advancement of Thomas Prescott. The next line authorized commercial debt mitigation for Prescott Maritime Supply. There was no ambiguity. There was no misunderstanding. I was staring at a calculated blueprint designed to strip my financial autonomy. He planned to take the money my grandfather left me and divide it between his failing business and my entitled brother. I felt a cold, hollow sensation expand in my chest. I turned to the final page of the folder. It was not a typed legal document. It was a piece of yellow lined paper ripped from a standard legal pad. The page was covered in blue ink. I brought the light closer. The breath caught in my throat. Richard had written my name over and over again. Indiana Prescott, Indiana Prescott, Indiana Prescott. The first few lines were written in his own sharp, jagged handwriting. But as my eyes tracked down the page, the script began to change. The letters became softer. The loops of the capital I and the lowercase a became wider. He was practicing my signature. He was sitting in this dark office late at night, meticulously studying the way I wrote my own name. The betrayal shifted from a theoretical legal manipulation into a visceral, physical crime. He was not just planning to guilt me into signing the power of attorney over breakfast. He was preparing a contingency plan. If I refused to sign the documents voluntarily, he was preparing to forge my signature. He was preparing to commit federal wire fraud to ensure the money flowed into his holding company. The reality of his premeditation hit me like a physical blow. A sudden rush of bitter bile rose in the back of my throat. My hands began to shake so violently I almost dropped the phone. The man who sat by my hospital bed when I had pneumonia was practicing a felony to steal my future. I forced my hands to steady. I needed this hard proof for the corporate trustee in Hartford. Evelyn had told me that irrefutable evidence of intended fraud would bulletproof the irrevocable Spendthrift Trust against any future legal challenges. I opened the camera application on my phone. I verified the flash and the shutter sound were disabled. I photographed the email chain. I photographed every single page of the durable power of attorney, making sure the dates and the allocation clauses were perfectly legible. Finally, I photographed the yellow legal pad. I captured the progression of the forged signatures in high resolution. I closed the manila folder. I placed it back into the steel drawer exactly where I found it, wedged behind the environmental permits. I pushed the heavy metal drawer shut. I used the back of my pick to reset the locking bar. I walked out of the office and locked the oak door behind me. I moved quickly through the silent warehouse. I stepped out the side door and locked the deadbolt. The cold air off the river hit my face. I walked to my rusted sedan and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove away from the boatyard. As I merged onto the coastal highway, the adrenaline that had fueled my infiltration began to evaporate. It vanished rapidly, leaving a terrifying void in its wake. The psychological trauma of staring at those forged signatures manifested as a sudden, intense physical reaction. My vision swam. A heavy, dull ache pulsed behind my eyes. My skin felt clammy and freezing, yet sweat beaded on my forehead. My body was rejecting the emotional horror of the betrayal. I needed to get back to the Colonial House in Groton before Richard returned from the conference. I gripped the steering wheel as a severe fever spiked through my veins, threatening to tear down my pristine facade just when I needed it the most. The physical toll of breaking into that filing cabinet hit me on Sunday morning. I tried to stand up from my mattress, and my legs immediately gave out. A deep ache radiated through my bones. My skin burned. I was running a high fever. I dragged myself back under the heavy quilt. I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom in Groton. I could hear the wind rattling the glass panes. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to email my forensic accounting professors in New Haven. I typed out a brief message explaining my absence due to sudden illness. My phone felt heavy in my hand. The digital photo gallery sat just one tap away. Those high-resolution images of the forged power of attorney were a radioactive weight. They were the key to my survival. They were also the exact mechanism destroying my family. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. The fever brought vivid, disjointed dreams. I saw the yellow legal pad floating in dark water. I saw my own signature written in blue ink wrapping around my throat like a wire. I woke up shivering and drenched in cold sweat. It was early afternoon when I heard the heavy front door open downstairs. Richard was supposed to be at the boatyard managing a delayed shipping manifest until dusk. I heard his boots on the stairs. The floorboards creaked under his familiar heavy stride. I braced myself for an interrogation. The bedroom door pushed open gently. Richard stood in the doorway, holding a white paper bag. The rich smell of chicken broth and roasted vegetables filled the stale air of my room. He walked over to my nightstand and set the bag down. He did not look like a corporate thief. He looked like a worried parent. He noticed my pale face and the sweat on my brow. He walked into the adjoining bathroom and ran the cold tap. He returned a moment later with a damp white washcloth. He sat down on the edge of my mattress. The bed dipped under his weight. He folded the cold cloth and placed it gently across my forehead. The sudden chill provided an immediate, agonizing relief. He kept his rough, calloused hand resting on top of the fabric. He asked how long I had been burning up. I told him the fever started at dawn. He sighed and adjusted the blanket around my shoulders. He told me he left the docks early when he realized my rusted sedan was still in the driveway. He went straight to the old diner down on Route 1 to buy my favorite soup. He poured the broth into a ceramic mug and handed it to me. I took a slow sip. The broth was warm and salty. It tasted exactly like my childhood. It tasted like safety. A sudden, sharp ache bloomed right behind my ribs. It was an intense, emotional hunger that I could not control. I wanted my father back. I wanted the man who sat in the pediatric ward when I had pneumonia to stay here forever. I stared at the lines around his eyes and the gray hair at his temples. The sheer exhaustion of fighting a secret war against my own blood felt unbearable. I was only 19 years old. I did not want to hire corporate trustees or navigate federal banking laws. I did not want to pick locks in freezing warehouses. I just wanted to be a normal college student. I wanted to drink my soup and let my father take care of the adult problems. The urge to surrender hit me with terrifying force. I looked at my phone resting on the nightstand. It would be so incredibly easy to stop the fight right now. I could unlock the screen and delete the album of photographs. I could wipe the evidence of his betrayal from existence. I could call Evelyn at the law firm in New Haven tomorrow morning. I could tell her to cancel the irrevocable Spendthrift trust. I could tell her to refund the remainder of my pawn shop cash. I could let the 45-day window collapse and allow the December deadline to pass. If I surrendered, he would execute the power of attorney. He would take the generation skipping trust and funnel it into Prescott Family Holdings. He would pay off the diesel suppliers and fund my brother in Boston. But in exchange, I would get to keep the illusion of a loving family. I would never have to see the look of betrayal on his face. He dipped the cloth into a glass of ice water and wrung it out. He placed it back on my head. He told me to rest and focus on getting better. He said the maritime business was stressful, but he would always make time to take care of his kids. His voice was incredibly soft. A single tear slipped out of the corner of my eye. It ran down my temple and soaked into the pillowcase. It was a pathetic, imperfect moment. I was on the verge of giving up my entire financial independence for a bowl of soup and a cold washcloth. I wanted the lie more than I wanted the truth. I wanted the lie more than I wanted the truth. I closed my eyes and leaned into his hand. I prepared to let the defense fall apart. I took a deep breath. Then my memory supplied a vivid flash of blue ink on yellow paper. Indiana Prescott, Indiana Prescott, Indiana Prescott. The image struck my brain like a bolt of lightning. The warm illusion shattered instantly. The man stroking my hair was the exact same man sitting alone in a dark office practicing a felony. He was the man studying the loops of my signature to ensure he could steal my future if I dared to refuse him. His current kindness was not a protective shield. It was a maintenance routine. He needed me healthy and functional so I could continue playing the role of the resilient survivor. He needed me to trust him blindly so the ambush on my 20th birthday would go smoothly. He was watering a plant he intended to harvest. The cold reality washed over me. It extinguished the pathetic desire to surrender. I opened my eyes and looked at him. I kept my face blank and unreadable. I took another sip of the broth. I thanked him for coming home early. He smiled and stood up from the bed. He told me to finish the soup and get some sleep. He walked out of the room and pulled the door shut behind him. I listened to his boots descend the stairs. The lock clicked into place. I reached over and grabbed my phone. I opened the photo gallery and stared at the forged signatures. I forced myself to study every single stolen curve of my own name. I etched the betrayal into my mind to ensure I would never experience a moment of weakness like that again. I had to maintain this cold detachment to survive the remaining weeks. My fever broke late that evening. The physical illness retreated, but the psychological landscape had fundamentally altered. I knew I possessed the strength to follow the Hartford plan to the bitter end. I knew I could look my father in the eye and watch his world burn. But the actual cost of this war was about to become sickeningly clear. My phone vibrated on the mattress beside me. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a text message from my brother Thomas up in Boston. He was coming home for the weekend. He wanted to complain about his law school workload and discuss his upcoming tuition bill. He was arriving the next day to unknowingly demand the very money I was currently locking away. I spent the entire weekend staring at the syllabus for my forensic accounting midterm. The mandatory review session in New Haven was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. The corporate trustee appointment in Hartford was set for 3. The geographical reality made attendance at both impossible. I had to choose between the immediate survival of my university scholarship and the permanent security of my grandfather's trust. I chose the trust. Tuesday morning, I walked onto the Metro North train in Groton wearing a black wool coat and carrying a leather portfolio instead of my canvas backpack. I did not commute down the coastline to my classes. I transferred at the main hub and rode the northbound rail line straight into the heart of the Connecticut Financial District. Hartford is a city constructed of glass and steel. It is the insurance capital of the country. It is defined by towering corporate structures and the quiet, efficient movement of massive wealth. It was the perfect place to build an impenetrable vault. I walked 3 blocks from the station to a high-rise building overlooking the river. The lobby was lined with imported marble and quiet security personnel. I took the elevator to the 32nd floor. The brass lettering on the frosted glass doors read, Midland Corporate Trust Services. I was 19 years old. I was a broke college student wearing thrift store boots. I was about to execute a legal maneuver designed for multi-million-dollar estates. I stepped up to the reception desk and gave my name. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored charcoal suit walked into the lobby. He introduced himself as David Caldwell. He was the senior fiduciary officer assigned to my account by Evelyn. He possessed the calm, reassuring demeanor of a man who managed generational wealth for a living. He led me down a silent, carpeted hallway into a private, glass-walled conference room. David sat across from me at a polished mahogany table. He opened a thick manila folder. He did not ask me about my classes or my weekend. He treated me like a serious corporate entity. He told me Evelyn had forwarded the preliminary engagement letter and the retainer funds from New Haven. He said his team had spent the last week initiating the federal underwriting process mandated by the Bank Secrecy Act. He slid a stack of dense legal documents across the table. These were the foundational blueprints for the new irrevocable Spendthrift Trust. He walked me through the complex architecture piece by piece. He explained that upon execution on my 20th birthday, the generation-skipping assets would automatically transfer from the original holding account directly into Midland Corporate Trust Services. The new entity was designed as a fortress. I was listed as the sole beneficiary. David explicitly pointed to the exclusion clauses. He read the names aloud: Richard Prescott, Thomas Prescott, Prescott Family Holdings, LLC, Prescott Maritime Supply. They were permanently legally barred from acting as beneficiaries or trustees. He said the language was airtight. He flipped to the spendthrift provision. He explained that this specific clause was the ultimate defense mechanism against my father's forged power of attorney. Even if Richard successfully executed a fraudulent transfer document the morning of my birthday, the corporate trustee would reject the demand. David told me that no creditor could attach a lien to the trust. No family member could pressure a lump sum withdrawal. The funds were locked down by strict fiduciary duty. David looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He told me the structure was irreversible. He said once I signed the final execution documents, not even I could dissolve the trust or reallocate the principal without a lengthy court process. He asked me if I fully understood the permanence of this decision. He warned me that if I ever experienced a moment of weakness and wanted to hand the money over to my family, I would be legally prevented from doing so. I thought about Thomas drinking his artisan latte and complaining about his Beacon Hill apartment. I thought about Richard sitting in the dark, mystic warehouse, practicing my signature on a yellow legal pad. I looked David directly in the eye. I told him I understood perfectly. I told him permanence was exactly what I was purchasing. He nodded and handed me a heavy black fountain pen. I signed my name on the designated lines of the preliminary formation documents. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy bond paper. The first phase of the federal review was complete. David gathered the pages and placed them back into the manila folder. He told me the final step of the 45-day protocol required a secure, digital execution. He explained that the actual transfer of assets could only occur precisely when the original trust vested. That meant I had to sign the final authorization documents the moment I turned 20 years old. He said his office would send a secure, encrypted link to my personal email address late on the evening of December 9th. I had to access the portal and provide a digital signature using a two-factor authentication code. He emphasized the critical nature of the timeline. If the digital signature was not logged and verified by the system before dawn on my birthday, the funds would remain in a transitional state. In that vulnerable window, my father could execute his power of attorney and freeze the assets. David said the execution was scheduled for 11 at night on December 9th. That gave the banking system exactly 1 hour to clear the transfer before midnight. He told me to ensure I had a stable internet connection and a quiet place to complete the process. He shook my hand and walked me back to the elevator bank. I rode the train back down to the shoreline. The sun was setting over the frozen marshes. The legal architecture was built. The corporate trustee was secured. The trap was set. All I had to do was survive the next few weeks and click a link on my laptop. It sounded incredibly simple. It sounded foolproof. But I had just skipped a mandatory midterm review session in New Haven to secure that meeting. My academic camouflage was fractured. The professor noticed my absence. He recorded the penalty against my final grade curve. The consequences of that decision were about to ripple through my carefully constructed double life. When I walked through the front door of the colonial house in Groton, Richard was waiting in the kitchen. He was not holding a bowl of soup. He was holding a printed academic warning letter that the university had mailed to our home address. He demanded to know why his highly focused, self-sufficient daughter was suddenly failing her forensic accounting requirements just weeks before a major family financial restructuring. The printed academic warning letter rested on the kitchen island between us. It bore the official seal of the university registrar. Richard tapped his grease-stained finger against the thick paper. He wanted to know why his pragmatic and self-sufficient daughter had skipped a mandatory forensic accounting review session. He wanted to know why I was jeopardizing my scholarship right before a significant family financial restructuring. I looked at the letter and then at the rigid posture of my father. My mind raced through a dozen fabricated excuses. I needed a story that satisfied his inherent need for control without triggering a deeper investigation. I decided to weaponize the only vulnerability he had shown me in the past month. I used the fever. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him the lingering effects of the illness had caught up with me on Tuesday afternoon. I reminded him about the high fever and the cold washcloth. I said I had boarded the Metro North train but felt too dizzy to walk from the station to the lecture hall. I claimed I spent the afternoon resting in the campus infirmary instead of attending the review. Richard studied my face. He was searching for a lie. He prided himself on his ability to read the subtle tells of his dock workers and diesel suppliers. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and even. I did not blink or look away. I let him see a tired college student who had simply pushed herself too hard. The tension in the kitchen slowly uncoiled. His rigid shoulders dropped an inch. He nodded and slid the warning letter into the trash bin. He told me my health was more important than a single attendance grade. He said the family would have plenty of resources by next month anyway, so I should not stress over a partial scholarship. He bought the lie because it fit his preferred narrative. He wanted to be the benevolent provider, and I had just handed him the script. I walked upstairs to my bedroom with my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had survived the immediate interrogation, but the margin for error was shrinking rapidly. The calendar on my wall indicated I had exactly 15 days left until December 10th. The federal underwriting protocol was nearing its final stage. The next morning, I boarded the northbound train to Hartford for the most critical appointment of my life. The Connecticut Financial District was a stark contrast to the rusting boatyards of Groton. Hartford was a city constructed of sheer glass and polished steel. It was the insurance capital of the country. It represented the quiet, efficient movement of generational wealth. It was the perfect terrain to build an impenetrable vault. I walked 3 blocks from the transit hub to a towering high-rise overlooking the river. The lobby was lined with imported marble and secured by silent personnel. I took the elevator to the 32nd floor. The brass lettering on the frosted glass doors read, Regional Corporate Trust Services. I was a 19-year-old girl wearing thrift store boots and carrying a canvas backpack. I was about to execute a legal maneuver designed for elite corporate entities. A senior fiduciary officer named Mr. Bennett met me in the reception area. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and possessed the calm, reassuring demeanor of a man who managed risk for a living. He led me down a carpeted hallway into a private, glass-walled conference room. He did not ask me about my classes or my commute. He treated me like a serious client. Mr. Bennett opened a thick manila folder on the polished mahogany table. He told me the preliminary engagement funds had cleared. He said his team had spent the last several weeks satisfying the rigorous identity verification protocols mandated by federal banking laws. The underwriting was complete. It was time to finalize the legal architecture. He slid a stack of dense legal documents across the table. These were the foundational blueprints for the new irrevocable Spendthrift Trust. He walked me through the complex structure piece by piece. He explained that upon execution on my 20th birthday, the generation-skipping assets would automatically transfer from the original holding account directly into the custody of the corporate bank. The new entity was designed as a fortress. I was listed as the sole beneficiary. Mr. Bennett explicitly pointed to the exclusion clauses on the 3rd page. He read the names aloud: Richard Prescott, Thomas Prescott, Prescott Family Holdings, LLC, Prescott Maritime Supply. The document permanently barred them from acting as beneficiaries or trustees. The language was cold, precise, and unforgiving. He turned the page and highlighted the Spendthrift provision. I leaned forward and read the text. In my forensic accounting seminars, we studied how spendthrift clauses protected wealthy heirs from their own poor decisions. Today, I was using it to protect myself from a predatory parent. Mr. Bennett explained that this specific legal barrier was the ultimate defense mechanism against the forged power of attorney sitting in the Mystic Warehouse. Even if Richard successfully filed a fraudulent transfer document the morning of my birthday, the corporate trustee would automatically reject the demand. The bank possessed a strict fiduciary duty to me alone. No external creditor could attach a lien to the trust. No family member could pressure a lump sum withdrawal to cover law school tuition or unpaid commercial diesel invoices. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He wanted to ensure I understood the gravity of the paperwork. He told me the structure was entirely irreversible. He warned me that once I signed the final execution documents, not even I could dissolve the trust without a lengthy and expensive court process. If I ever experienced a moment of weakness and wanted to hand the money over to my brother, I would be legally prevented from doing so. I thought about Thomas drinking his artisan latte and complaining about the ambient noise in a heated library. I thought about Richard sitting in the dark office, practicing the curves of my signature on a yellow pad. I looked Mr. Bennett directly in the eye. I told him permanence was exactly what I was purchasing. He nodded and handed me a heavy black pen. I signed my name on the designated lines of the preliminary formation documents. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy bond paper. The physical act of signing felt like locking a heavy steel door. Mr. Bennett gathered the pages and placed them back into the folder. He told me the final step of the 45-day protocol required a secure digital execution. The actual transfer of assets could only occur precisely when the original trust vested. That meant I had to sign the final authorization documents the moment I turned 20 years old. He said his office would send a secure, encrypted link to my personal email address late on the evening of December 9th. I had to access the portal and provide a digital signature using a two-factor authentication code. He emphasized the critical nature of the timeline. If the digital signature was not logged and verified by the system before dawn on my birthday, the funds would remain in a transitional state. In that vulnerable window, my father could execute his power of attorney and freeze the assets. Mr. Bennett set the execution window for 11 at night on December 9th. That gave the banking system exactly 1 hour to clear the transfer before midnight. He told me to ensure I had a stable internet connection and a quiet place to complete the process. He shook my hand and escorted me back to the elevator bank. I rode the train back down to the shoreline. The legal architecture was built. The corporate trustee was secured. The trap was set. All I had to do was survive the next 2 weeks and click a link on my laptop. The waiting game began. I returned to the Colonial House in Groton and resumed my daily routine. The final 14 days were an exercise in psychological endurance. I sat across from Richard at the dinner table every single night. I ate the food he cooked. I listened to his stories about the boatyard. I watched him casually mention the upcoming financial restructuring with a warm, reassuring tone. He thought he was managing a compliant, ignorant daughter. He had no idea he was sharing a house with a corporate adversary who had already checkmated his entire existence. The cognitive dissonance of living in that environment threatened to crack my focus. Every tick of the kitchen clock felt like a hammer striking an anvil. 10 days left. 5 days left. 3 days left. I packed my accounting textbooks and maintained my perfect grades. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. The calendar flipped to December 9th. The finish line was merely hours away. I planned to sit in my bedroom, log on to the encrypted portal, and quietly finalize my freedom while Richard slept down the hall. But true obstacles rarely adhere to a convenient schedule. As the sun set on the eve of my 20th birthday, the barometric pressure along the Connecticut coastline began to drop rapidly. The sky turned a bruised, ugly shade of purple. The local news stations interrupted their evening broadcasts to issue severe weather warnings. A late-season coastal storm was brewing over the Atlantic, and it was heading directly toward Groton. The clock on my laptop read 10:30. It was the night of December 9th. Exactly 90 minutes separated me from my 20th birthday. I was sitting cross-legged on my mattress, wearing a heavy wool sweater. My bedroom door was locked. Down the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic snoring of my father. He was sleeping soundly because he thought he held a winning hand. He thought tomorrow morning was going to be a simple administrative extraction. Growing up on the Connecticut shoreline teaches you to respect the barometer. A winter storm in New England is not a standard weather event. It is a brutal atmospheric collision. We call them nor'easters. Cold Arctic air meets warm Gulf Stream moisture, resulting in a churning system that batters the coast with hurricane-force winds and freezing precipitation. My grandfather used to sit on his porch and watch the gray clouds roll over the sound. He always told me that a commercial shipping vessel is only as strong as its anchor line during a heavy blow. My anchor line was currently a secure digital portal located in a Hartford financial high-rise. I just needed the email to arrive. The wind outside my window was no longer a steady whistle. It was a deep, guttural roar. Rain lashed against the glass like handfuls of gravel. The old colonial house groaned under the shifting atmospheric pressure. I stared at the bright screen of my laptop. My inbox was empty. Mr. Bennett had promised the encrypted link would deploy exactly at 10:30. That specific time frame was engineered to give me ample buffer for the two-factor authentication process. I refreshed the page. I watched the small loading circle spin and disappear. Still nothing. At 10:42, the lights in my bedroom flickered. The digital clock on my nightstand dimmed into a faint red line and surged back to full brightness. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I hit the refresh button on my browser again. The email from Midland Corporate Trust Services appeared at the top of the list. The subject line read, "Final authorization required." I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. I moved my cursor over the bold blue link. Before my finger could press the trackpad, a deafening crack echoed over the howling wind outside. It sounded like heavy artillery fire. A towering oak branch in our front yard had snapped under the gale force winds. It crashed onto the street, taking the main utility lines down with it. A split second later, the entire house went dark. The low hum of the refrigerator downstairs ceased. The glowing green lights of the internet router in the hallway died instantly. The only illumination left in my bedroom was the pale blue glow of my laptop screen. I sat frozen in the shadows. The sudden silence inside the house was oppressive against the chaos raging outdoors. I stared at the browser window. A small gray dinosaur icon appeared on the screen above a text reading, "No internet connection." The wireless signal indicator in the bottom right corner displayed a harsh diagonal slash. I grabbed my cell phone from the mattress. The screen illuminated my panicked face. I turned off the wireless setting and tried to switch to the cellular data network. The signal indicator at the top of the screen showed a single hollow bar. I opened a mobile browser and tried to load the email application. The progress bar crawled a fraction of an inch and stalled. An error message popped up stating the server could not be reached. The coastal cell towers were either damaged by the falling trees or overwhelmed by thousands of local residents suddenly trying to report power outages to Eversource. The gravity of the situation crashed into me. My forensic accounting curriculum covered the legal parameters of digital commerce. Federal banking regulations governing electronic signatures are unforgiving. The e-Sign Act requires a verified digital timestamp connected to a secure server. If I did not access that Hartford portal and authenticate my identity before midnight, the corporate banking system would automatically void the session. The 45-day underwriting window would reset. The irrevocable Spendthrift trust would remain an unfunded theoretical concept. When the sun rose tomorrow, the generation skipping trust would vest into a highly vulnerable transitional state. Richard would wake up, pour his coffee, and walk to his mystic boatyard. He would utilize the commercial battery-powered generator in his warehouse to fax the forged, durable power of attorney to the holding bank. He would drain my inheritance before I could even find a working phone to call my lawyer. My grandfather's legacy would vanish into commercial diesel debts and law school tuition for a brother who did not deserve it. A raw, unfiltered panic gripped my chest. It was the same visceral terror I felt in the cold driveway weeks ago, but amplified by the ticking clock. My hands began to shake with rapid tremors. I dropped my phone onto the quilt. I could not breathe. I was trapped in a dark, freezing bedroom, watching the greatest defense strategy I had ever built unravel because of a random meteorological event. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch the drywall until my knuckles bled. I had sacrificed my grandmother's vintage jewelry to a pawnbroker in Westport. I had risked my university scholarship by skipping a mandatory midterm review. I had picked locks, navigated federal banking laws, and studied corporate fraud. I had executed every single step with cold, clinical precision. It was profoundly unfair that a broken oak branch was going to hand my father the victory. Tears of hot frustration pricked the corners of my eyes. I sat on the edge of the mattress, paralyzed by the unfairness of the universe. My mind spun in frantic circles, looking for a loophole that did not exist. There was no backup plan for a collapsed power grid. There was no paper document I could sign in the dark to satisfy the corporate trustee. I forced myself to inhale the cold, stale air of my bedroom. Crying in the dark would not secure a digital timestamp. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. I closed my laptop and shoved it into my canvas backpack. I needed an active internet connection, and I needed it in less than 70 minutes. The Groton residential grid was dead. The cell towers were useless. I had to find a commercial generator connected to an underground fiber optic line. I knew there was a 24-hour truck stop diner located 3 miles away near the interstate highway junction. It was a worn-down establishment that catered to long-haul logistics drivers. They kept their infrastructure hardened against coastal storms because their clientele relied on constant connectivity. It was my only option. But reaching that diner presented a terrifying new obstacle. I had to sneak past the master bedroom without waking a man who slept with the light sleep of a stressed business owner. I had to navigate a pitch-black house holding a heavy backpack. Most dangerous of all, I had to drive a 10-year-old rusted sedan through a blinding New England storm on flooded coastal roads. If my father woke up and heard the front door open, he would demand to know where I was going in the middle of a blackout. The ambush would start hours ahead of schedule. He would try to physically block me from leaving the house. I zipped my backpack shut and slung it over my shoulder. I put on my heavy boots. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob of my bedroom. The wood felt like ice. I turned the knob with agonizing slowness, praying the old hinges would stay silent. I turned the brass knob of my bedroom door. The metal was freezing against my skin. I eased the door open a fraction of an inch at a time. The hallway was a pitch-black cavern. The only sound was the violent wind slamming against the colonial siding and the low, rhythmic snoring coming from the master bedroom. Richard slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who believed his financial salvation was guaranteed at dawn. I walked down the wooden stairs, placing my feet on the extreme edges of the treads to avoid the familiar creaks. I moved like a ghost in my own home. I reached the mudroom and grabbed my car keys from the ceramic bowl. My fingers brushed the cold metal. I slipped out the side door and pulled it shut until the latch clicked silently. The Connecticut storm hit me the second I stepped off the porch. The rain was not falling, it was flying horizontally. It felt like icy gravel hitting my face. I ran to my rusted sedan and yanked the heavy door open. I threw my canvas backpack onto the passenger seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The old engine coughed twice before turning over. The headlights cut a weak yellow path through the driving rain. I backed out of the driveway and turned onto the coastal road. Driving a 10-year-old sedan through a severe coastal storm is an exercise in pure survival. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, useless rhythm. The pavement was covered in 2 inches of standing water. My tires were severely worn. My grandfather had taught me how to handle a skid on icy shipyard roads when I was 16. He told me to steer into the slide and never touch the brakes. I felt the steering wheel go completely slack in my hands as I hit a flooded intersection near the Mystic River. The car hydroplaned. I was floating on a cushion of water, drifting dangerously close to the steel guardrail. My heart slammed against my ribs. I lifted my foot off the accelerator and turned the wheel slightly to the right. The tires caught the asphalt with a harsh, violent jerk. The car stabilized. I was risking my actual physical life to save my financial future. It was a terrifying calculus. I gripped the wheel and kept my eyes locked on the faint white lines of the highway. I drove for 3 miles, navigating downed tree branches and flooded storm drains. Through the sheets of rain, I saw the glowing red neon sign of the Interstate Truck Stop Diner. It was a concrete block building surrounded by massive 18-wheeler trucks. The commercial diesel generator hummed loudly around the back. The parking lot was a shallow lake. I parked near the front entrance, grabbed my backpack, and ran through the deluge. I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The interior was a sudden shock of bright fluorescent light and the smell of burnt coffee and fried grease. Several truck drivers sat at the counter wearing damp flannel shirts. They looked at me with mild confusion. I was a soaking wet 19-year-old girl carrying a laptop bag at 1:45. I walked straight to the waitress behind the register. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably. I asked her for the wireless internet password. I did not bother explaining the situation. I just handed her a crumpled $10 bill from my pocket and asked for a cup of black coffee and the network key. She took the money and wrote a string of letters on a paper napkin. I slid into a red vinyl booth in the back corner. My wool sweater was heavy with rainwater. I was shivering so violently, my shoulders ached. I unzipped my backpack and pulled out my laptop. I opened the screen and typed the password from the napkin into the network settings. The wireless icon pulsed, searching for a signal. It locked onto the commercial broadband network. The connection was established. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of my screen. 11:52. I had exactly 8 minutes left until midnight. 8 minutes until my 20th birthday. 8 minutes until the 45-day underwriting window collapsed and my father won the war. I opened my email and clicked the encrypted link sent by the Hartford corporate trustee. A new browser tab opened. A small blue circle began to spin in the center of the screen. The loading sequence stalled. The storm outside was disrupting the satellite uplinks for the commercial internet provider. The circle spun relentlessly. My lungs felt tight. I stared at the spinning icon. I prayed to a God I rarely spoke to. I asked my grandfather to help me hold the line. 11:55. 11:56. 11:57. The screen flashed white. The legal document loaded. The header read, Master Execution Authorization for the Indiana Prescott Irrevocable Spendthrift Trust. Below the dense legal paragraphs was a single, blank, digital field. This was the mechanism governed by the federal electronic signature laws. I placed my trembling fingers on the trackpad. I moved the cursor to the signature box. The clock ticked to 11:58. I typed my full legal name, Indiana Prescott. I hit the enter key. The system requested the two-factor authentication code. A text message chimed on my phone. I typed the 6-digit number into the security field and clicked Submit. The screen froze for an agonizing 10 seconds. It was processing the data packet, routing it through the federal banking verification servers. The clock hit midnight. I was 20 years old. At 12:02, a new email arrived in my inbox. The subject line read, Transaction verified and custody transferred. I clicked the message. The attached document contained a receipt of execution from Midland Corporate Trust Services. The Generation Skipping Trust was officially funded into the Armored Vault. The Spendthrift Clause was active. Richard Prescott, Thomas Prescott, and Prescott Maritime Supply were permanently legally barred from the principal. No commercial creditor could attach a lien. No forged power of attorney could pierce the corporate barrier. The money was locked securely out of their reach. I sat in the vinyl booth and let out a long, ragged breath. My body slumped against the red cushion. The shivering stopped. I had won the silent war. I had secured my absolute financial independence. But the victory brought a terrifying realization. The digital armor was perfectly constructed, but I still had to go back to the colonial house. I had to face the man who thought he owned my future. I ordered a second cup of black coffee and watched the rain hit the diner window. I waited for the sun to rise, because I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the kitchen island. The drive back to Groton from the interstate truck stop was a slow navigation through a bruised landscape. The morning sun was trying to pierce through the heavy gray clouds left behind by the storm. The coastal roads were littered with snapped pine branches and debris washed up from the high tide. I passed 3 distinct convoys of yellow Eversource utility trucks. The local news reports from the past decade frequently detailed how the aging Connecticut power grid strained and failed under the pressure of severe nor'easters. The utility crews were already working to clear the fallen oak tree from my street. I parked my rusted sedan in the driveway. The digital clock on the dashboard read 7:45. The lights inside the colonial house were glowing warmly through the front windows. The power had been restored. I walked through the mudroom door and took off my damp wool coat. I hung my backpack on a brass hook. The house smelled intensely of melted butter, sweet maple syrup, and roasted coffee beans. It was the exact smell of every childhood birthday I had ever celebrated in this home. I walked down the short hallway and stepped into the kitchen. Richard stood at the stove. He wore a clean flannel shirt and a cheerful expression. He was using a metal spatula to flip a tall stack of pancakes on a cast iron griddle. He turned his head and smiled a wide, bright smile. He wished me a happy 20th birthday. He poured a mug of hot black coffee and placed it on the kitchen island right next to my usual wooden stool. I sat down. My muscles ached from shivering in the diner booth all night. My eyes burned from a lack of sleep. I looked at the ceramic plate resting in front of me. 3 golden pancakes sat in a perfect, neat tower. To the right of the plate, resting parallel to my coffee mug, was a thick manila folder. Richard turned off the stove burners and leaned against the granite counter. He picked up his own coffee mug and took a slow sip. He did not immediately reach for the folder. He played the role of the benevolent patriarch, setting a comfortable domestic stage. He asked me how I slept through the heavy winds. He mentioned that the utility companies were getting faster at restoring the grid. Then his tone shifted. It dropped into a gentle, pragmatic register. He tapped his finger against the edge of the manila folder. He said, "Entering my 20s meant it was time to handle some routine, adult paperwork." He framed the conversation around the shifting local economy. He spoke about the recent state initiatives pushing for a new Connecticut blue economy. He explained that the state government was prioritizing high-tech marine research and sustainable coastal engineering over traditional working waterfronts. He told me legacy boatyards like Prescott Maritime Supply were facing intense regulatory pressure. He said small operators needed to undergo a family capital restructuring just to survive the new environmental mandates and compete for municipal contracts. He used dense corporate buzzwords to mask a very simple theft. He said the lawyers drafted a basic proxy agreement to shield my inheritance from excessive taxation while helping the family business transition into the modern shipping era. He slid the manila folder 2 inches across the island. It stopped right next to my fork. He smiled again and said it just required a few quick signatures on the sticky notes. He promised we could go out for a celebratory steak dinner after the paperwork was filed. I did not touch the folder right away. I looked at the heavy bond paper peeking out from the edges. I reached out and flipped the cover open. The document staring back at me was the exact durable power of attorney I had photographed in his dark mystic warehouse weeks ago. I saw the fiduciary allocation clauses. I saw the specific paragraphs directing funds to my brother's law school tuition and the commercial diesel suppliers. I looked at the bottom of the second page where the signature line waited. I knew exactly how many times he had practiced forging my name on a yellow legal pad just in case I refused this very breakfast invitation. I had rehearsed this specific confrontation 100 times in my head. I had pictured myself delivering a cold, flawless, cinematic speech. I wanted to look him in the eye and tear his arrogance apart with sharp, decisive words. But I was not an action hero. I was a 20-year-old girl sitting in the kitchen of the man who raised me. The adrenaline from the truck stop diner had worn off. Only a raw, terrifying fear remained. I tried to speak, but my throat closed tight. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up at him. I opened my mouth and a weak, pathetic sound came out. I took a shaky breath and tried again. My voice cracked on the first syllable. I told him I could not sign the papers. Richard chuckled a soft, dismissive sound. He told me not to worry about the legal jargon. He said he would handle all the complex banking transfers. He just needed my name on the line. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island to stop my hands from trembling. I stammered over the legal terms. I told him the Generation Skipping Trust was no longer held in the original account. I stumbled over the pronunciation of the corporate entity. I forced the words out in a disjointed, frantic rush. I told him the assets vested at midnight and were immediately transferred into a new, irrevocable Spendthrift trust managed by Midland Corporate Trust Services in Hartford. Richard froze. He held his ceramic mug suspended halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted from my face to the open manila folder. He asked me to repeat what I just said. His voice lost all its warmth. It was a flat, dangerous sound. I swallowed hard. I told him the money was locked in a corporate vault. I told him the trust terms permanently excluded him and Thomas and the Maritime Holding Company from ever accessing the principal. I said the transfer cleared the federal banking servers at 2 minutes past midnight. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I watched his brain process the information. I watched the confident patriarch realize his entire carefully constructed timeline had been dismantled by a daughter he thought he controlled. The ceramic mug slipped from his fingers. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, deafening crack. Hot black coffee splashed across the cabinets and pooled around his heavy work boots. Sharp shards of white ceramic scattered across the kitchen tiles. He did not look down at the mess. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The polished facade of the successful business owner melted away in an instant. The man standing across from me looked old, gray, and profoundly desperate. His breathing turned ragged. He placed both hands flat on the granite counter and leaned his weight toward me. He did not yell. He begged. The raw panic in his voice was far more terrifying than anger. He pleaded with me to call the bank in Hartford. He told me to cancel the transfer. He said I did not understand the true reality of the ledger. He confessed that Prescott Maritime Supply was not just struggling to adapt to a changing economy. He admitted the firm was bankrupt. The commercial diesel suppliers were preparing to seize the supply boats by the end of the week. He said the bank was threatening to foreclose on the very house we were standing in. He admitted Thomas was going to be evicted from his Boston apartment because the law school tuition wire had already bounced twice. He laid the entire devastating truth bare on the kitchen island. He looked at me with pleading, desperate eyes. He said I was the only thing standing between the family legacy and total ruin. He asked me how I could abandon my own blood to save a bank account. He tried to dump decades of his own financial failures directly onto my shoulders. I looked at the spilled coffee soaking into the grout of the floor tiles. The fear that had paralyzed my vocal cords began to recede. It was replaced by a deep, numbing exhaustion. I looked back at his desperate face. I did not stammer this time. I told him the word irrevocable meant permanent. I told him the corporate trustee possessed a strict fiduciary duty to deny any withdrawal request that did not directly benefit my welfare. I told him that even if I called the bank and begged them to send him the money, the federal trust laws would prohibit the transaction. I told him the money was gone. Richard stared at me. The realization that his daughter had engineered a flawless legal trap sank into his bones. The kitchen descended into a toxic silence. The smell of sweet maple syrup felt sickening against the reality of the fractured family. The financial war was over, but the logistical nightmare of my physical escape was just beginning. I had to pack my belongings and leave this house before the shock wore off, and the desperate begging turned into something far more dangerous. I left Richard standing in the center of the kitchen, staring at the pool of spilled coffee. I did not wait for his shock to morph into bargaining or rage. I turned my back on him and walked up the wooden stairs for the last time. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. I walked into my bedroom and grabbed 2 cardboard boxes I had hidden in the back of my closet weeks ago. I did not pack memories. I left the childhood photographs pinned to the corkboard. I left the marine supply catalogs and the old nautical charts my grandfather had given me. I packed my accounting textbooks, my winter sweaters, and my laptop. I taped the boxes shut. The harsh tearing sound of the adhesive echoed in the quiet room. I carried the boxes down the hallway. I could hear Richard inside his home office. The heavy oak door was shut, but his voice bled through the wood. He sounded frantic. He was calling the commercial diesel suppliers, begging for a Friday extension on his invoices. He did not come out to stop me. The shock of my legal maneuver had pushed his brain into pure survival mode for his failing business. He was already trying to plug the holes in a ship that was currently resting on the ocean floor. I walked out the front door and let the heavy wood swing shut. I tossed my brass house key into the ceramic bowl in the mudroom before I left. I did not look back at the colonial facade. I loaded the boxes into the trunk of my rusted sedan and climbed into the driver's seat. I drove southbound on Interstate 95. The severe storm from the previous night was breaking apart over Long Island Sound. Pale sunlight pierced through the bruised gray clouds. I drove straight to New Haven. 2 days prior to my birthday, I had submitted a formal request to Midland Corporate Trust Services for an educational housing distribution. David Caldwell had approved the transfer pending the final digital signature. When the clock struck midnight and I authenticated the portal, the banking system executed the request. The funds were wired directly to a commercial property management company located near the university. I pulled my car up to a brick apartment building on Orange Street. I walked into the leasing office and collected my keys. The transaction was clean and impersonal. The leasing agent did not ask for a parental cosigner. They did not run a credit check on a 19-year-old student with no financial history. The corporate trustee had provided an ironclad proof of funds and executed its fiduciary duty perfectly. The legal armor worked. I unlocked the door to my new apartment. It was a small studio on the 4th floor. The walls were painted a sterile hospital white. The air smelled of fresh bleach and old radiator dust. I had no furniture. I dragged a cheap twin mattress I bought from a local discount store across the linoleum floor. I set it down in the corner of the bare room. I sat on the rough fabric. I looked out the narrow window at the Connecticut skyline. The Gothic university spires pierced the horizon. The distant traffic hummed a steady rhythm. I had won the war. The holding company was starved of capital. The forged power of attorney sitting in the Mystic warehouse was a useless piece of paper. Thomas would have to figure out how to pay his own rent in Boston. I was safe from their predatory spreadsheet logic. But sitting in that empty room, I did not feel a sudden rush of triumphant joy. I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. Winning a war against your own blood is a brutal, isolating experience. You survive the battlefield, but you lose the only family you ever knew. The victory is absolute, but it is incredibly lonely. I spent the next 4 years finishing my forensic accounting degree. I learned how to build my own safety net from scratch. I watched from a distance as Prescott Maritime Supply filed for commercial bankruptcy. I watched Thomas drop out of law school and move back to Groton to work a retail job. I never spoke to them again. If you are sitting in a dark room right now, realizing that the people who are supposed to protect you are actually harvesting your potential, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I paid a heavy physical and psychological price to learn the truth about toxic family dynamics. Here are 5 razor-sharp lessons I carried out of that freezing house. Lesson 1. Financial abuse almost always disguises itself as familial duty. Toxic parents do not hold a weapon to your head to take your money. They manufacture a crisis. They use guilt and obligation to make you feel selfish for wanting to keep what rightfully belongs to you. They demand you sacrifice your future to fix their past mistakes. Do not let them rebrand theft as love. Lesson 2. The golden child is a myth that destroys both siblings. Richard crippled Thomas by funding his mediocrity. He stripped away my brother's ability to survive the real world by handing him an endless safety net. Being the discarded child is agonizing, but it forces you to build an armored hull. The struggle gives you the tools to save your own life, while the golden child sinks the moment the funds run dry. Lesson 3. The law does not care about your feelings, and that makes it your greatest weapon. Emotion is the playground of the manipulator. They will use your empathy against you. They will bring you soup when you are sick to lower your defenses. Bureaucracy contracts and corporate trustees operate on cold, hard facts. When a parent tries to fight you with a guilt trip, you must fight them with a legally binding contract. The law is a stone wall they cannot manipulate. Lesson 4. Buying your psychological autonomy is expensive, and you pay for it with grief. Setting a permanent boundary means mourning the family you deserved, but never actually had. You have to accept the profound loneliness of the empty apartment to escape the suffocating weight of the colonial house. The grief is heavy, but the peace you purchase is worth the pain. Lesson 5. You do not need an apology to move forward. I never received closure from Richard. He never admitted he was wrong. He spent the rest of his life believing I was an ungrateful daughter who destroyed his maritime legacy. Waiting for a narcissist to validate your trauma will keep you trapped in their orbit forever. You give yourself closure by walking out the door and never looking back. The dust settled on my 20th birthday, but the fallout of the corporate trust sent shockwaves through my extended family. The bankruptcy of the boatyard uncovered decades of hidden financial maneuvers. If you want to hear exactly what happened when Thomas found out I locked the vault and how the diesel suppliers dismantled my father's empire, you need to stick around. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for Maya Tells Stories. Drop the word freedom in the comments if you made it to the end of this journey. I read every single one. The next chapter involves a federal bankruptcy courtroom, a shredded shipping contract, and an aunt who knew the truth the entire time. I will see you in part 2. I sat on that cheap mattress in New Haven and watched the city lights flicker to life. I had won the war against my own blood. My grandfather's legacy was locked safely inside a corporate vault where my father and my brother could never touch it. The victory was definitive, but it was incredibly lonely. Escaping a toxic family ecosystem leaves you with profound exhaustion. But as the years passed and I finished my forensic accounting degree, I realized that the heavy price of my independence was worth every single tear I shed in that freezing Groton driveway. If you are currently sitting in a house where your future is being treated like a financial asset, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I carried 5 brutal lessons out of that colonial home. Lesson 1. Financial abuse almost always disguises itself as familial duty. Toxic parents do not hold a weapon to your head. They manufacture a crisis. They use guilt and obligation to make you feel selfish for wanting to keep what rightfully belongs to you. They demand you sacrifice your future to fix their past mistakes. Do not let them rebrand theft as love. Lesson 2. The golden child is a myth that destroys both siblings. Richard crippled Thomas by funding his mediocrity. He stripped away my brother's ability to survive the real world by handing him an endless safety net. Being the discarded child is agonizing, but it forces you to build an armored hull. The struggle gives you the tools to save your own life, while the golden child sinks the moment the funds run dry. Lesson 3. The law does not care about your feelings, and that makes it your greatest weapon. Emotion is the playground of the manipulator. They will use your empathy against you. They will bring you soup when you are sick to lower your defenses. Bureaucracy and corporate trustees operate on cold, hard facts. When a parent tries to fight you with a guilt trip, you must fight them with a legally binding contract. The law is a stone wall they cannot manipulate. Lesson 4. Buying your psychological autonomy is expensive, and you pay for it with grief. Setting a permanent boundary means mourning the family you deserved but never actually had. You have to accept the profound loneliness of an empty apartment to escape the suffocating weight of a toxic home. The grief is heavy, but the peace you purchase is worth the pain. Lesson 5. You do not need an apology to move forward. I never received closure from Richard. He never admitted he was wrong. He spent the rest of his life believing I was an ungrateful daughter who destroyed his maritime legacy. Waiting for a narcissist to validate your trauma will keep you trapped in their orbit forever. You give yourself closure by walking out the door and never looking back. The dust settled on my 20th birthday, but the fallout of the corporate trust sent shockwaves through my extended family. The bankruptcy of the boatyard uncovered decades of hidden financial maneuvers. If you want me to make part 2, remember to subscribe so you do not miss it. Hit the like button and turn on notifications for Maya Tells Stories. Drop the word freedom in the comments if you made it to the end of this journey. I read every single one. The next chapter involves a federal bankruptcy courtroom,